The world's largest plane and storm center of a congressional inquiry awaits tests at its dock in Long Beach, California. Builder of the monster, Howard Hughes, stormy petrel of aviation, surveys the 320-foot wing of the Colossus, whose weight is 200 tons and whose length is 200 feet. Sections of the mammoth are as high as a 5-story building. Mr. Hughes' descent gives you an idea. On the taxiing deck, Hughes takes a last look as the monster dwarfs everything in its vicinity. There are 100 instruments to check on this panel alone before the test begins. A test that is to startle the aviation world. In the cockpit, Hughes sits at the controls. Incidentally, it takes 26,000 pounds hydraulic pressure to operate these controls. The air giant starts to move, driven by her 8 3,000 horsepower motors.
They said it would never fly, that it was a boondoggle, a waste of taxpayers' money. They called it a flying lumberyard, a flying boxcar, an eccentric millionaire's folly. Was this airplane, whose sheer size defies the imagination, really a folly? Or was it something else, a means to save American lives, an idea ahead of its time, a feat of American ingenuity, industry, and spirit? In 1939, Europe was at war. People were dying. The war was not restricted to land. German shipyards were manufacturing submarine U-boats with an aggressive goal of world dominance. In September 1939, the Nazi war machine launched an all-out assault on the shipping lanes of the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships by the dozen, killing soldiers and civilians, and crippling the economies and defense efforts of European allies.
That the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Between January and July of 1942, German U-boat submarines destroyed more than 200,000 tons of cargo and 681 Allied ships from 26 nations across the globe, including the United States. How could anyone combat this terrible underwater threat and maintain the transport of men, women, and materials vital to the survival of free Europe? On the West Coast, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser worried about the same problem. Beginning in March of 1941, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States provided Lend-Lease aid to Great Britain and her allies. Under this program, Kaiser pulled off the extraordinary achievement of mass-producing the Liberty ships that became the workhorses of Allied war transport. Anxious over the rising destruction of his Liberty ships by U-boats, Kaiser publicized the War Production Board's idea. Why not mass-produce an armada of flying boats to create an air bridge for the transportation of troops, equipment, and supplies for the war effort? There was one problem. Kaiser's new and innovative idea met with skepticism from the aviation industry, but he moved past the disappointing reactions and searched for support from someone more willing to embrace new ideas. He found a businessman known not only for his innovative thinking and aviation genius, but also for his daredevil exploits and dynamic personality. The man was Howard Hughes. Born on Christmas Eve 1905, Howard Hughes was the son of Howard Hughes Sr. The two became known as Big and Little Howard. Big Howard effectively revolutionized the oil drilling industry when he designed a pioneering drill bit that allowed oilmen to penetrate thick rock formations and get to rich oil deposits.
The first I learned about Mr. Hughes and heard the name Hughes was in the oil fields where they used their rock bits. But this was a special cone, 3-cone bit. It had burrs all over it, and boy, it'd chew up, it'd go right through concrete, anything, granite, whatever. But you didn't buy them, you only rented them. And if you run the spools off of them, or the cones, then it cost you plenty, because you had to pay for the whole bit then. But otherwise, you just rented the bit.
The senior Hughes became wealthy from the proceeds of his oil drilling tool bit invention and established Hughes Tool Company. Little Howard showed the same aptitude for mechanical engineering as his father. When Hughes Sr. died in 1924, he left his company and wealth to his son. A short time later, young Hughes moved to California, where he joined his movie-producing uncle, Rupert Hughes.
May I have your attention for just a moment? I want to present to you the feminine star of this spectacle, Hell's Angels. Oh, and what a lovely, lovely, beautiful creature, Jean Harlow.
Thank you. I would like to use this occasion to publicly thank Mr. Hughes for the opportunity he gave me.
Jean Harlow. And now you'll wait for your picture right there.
It was during the filming of Hell's Angels that the passion for flying overtook Hughes. By 1928, he had both his private and commercial pilot's rating. A desire to improve his airplanes drove him to aircraft design and engineering. He made a name for himself as a brilliant engineer and a larger-than-life record-breaking test pilot. Flying his H-1 Racer, Hughes set a record of 352 miles an hour in 1935.
This speed field is not a very appropriate setting for this little airplane, which is the new holder of the world's land plane speed record. Its forced landing here was caused by motor failure while it was being clocked by the National Aeronautical Association at an average speed of approximately 350 miles an hour, ample to surpass the old record of 314 held by the French. At the time the motor failed, it was traveling approximately 370. Failure was caused by faulty fuel supply system.
He went on to establish a new coast-to-coast record of 7 hours and 28 minutes. These and other accomplishments gained him national attention and awards, including 2 Harmon trophies, the Collier Trophy, and in 1941, a presidential citation for his round-the-world flight of 1938.
Greatest record established in the history of aviation. I know you're tired. Congratulations and welcome home. That's for the entire crew.
Thank you. I really should extend to these other men rather than me.
He became a hero known to every American in the thrilling golden days of aviation. Hughes was intrigued with Kaiser's plan and motivated by the idea of designing the world's largest airplane. In late August 1942, the pair reached a handshake agreement and the understanding that Hughes would design a flying boat and Kaiser would build it. Kaiser, anxious to get the word out, told the press about the agreement. When the news hit the headlines, Hughes became a bit concerned about his new partner's ambitious construction schedule. But the course already had been charted. The Defense Plant Corporation issued a letter of intent in September that outlined conditions for designing and constructing 3 flying boat cargo planes, 1 for static testing and 2 for flying. No more than $18 million would be allocated from the government for the flying boat project, and the authorization to design and construct the ships would expire in 24 months. With the formal contract signed in November 1942 and the Kaiser Hughes Corporation formed, the project was underway. But Hughes and Kaiser rarely came in contact. Beyond setting up the company offices at Culver City, Kaiser was scarcely involved. In fact, the letter of intent made it clear that Hughes was ultimately responsible for the engineering and construction of the flying boat. The prototype flying boat, now called the HK-1 for Hughes and Kaiser's first aircraft design, was a challenge for Hughes. He and his design team had no precedents to follow. They found it necessary to devise new methods of mechanical engineering before construction of the craft could begin. A twin-boom aircraft was considered at first, but later abandoned in favor of a single-hull flying boat capable of carrying 2 30-ton tanks with a full complement of armor and crew, or 3 light tanks and equipment. In 1940, President Roosevelt established a list of materials critical to the war effort and placed severe restrictions on private and commercial construction. Neither Hughes, Kaiser, nor their companies could collect fees or profit from the project. The aircraft could not be constructed from strategic wartime materials such as aluminum. They could use no engineers, technicians, or other skilled personnel from companies already occupied in the war effort.
When he couldn't get aluminum from the government during the war or beginning of the war to build airplanes, he built them out of wood. And that's, I admire the guy. You couldn't say no to Howard Hughes.
Between 1942 and 1946, more than 800 woodworkers from the United Brotherhood of Carpenters joined Hughes to assist with the flying boat project.
People had to go up to the North Country, Idaho, Oregon, looking for lumber. They cut down these big trees. They would peel them all out. If they found a knot, they'd throw it away. They picked the best wood in the forests of the United States to build that airplane.
No hangar existed that was large enough to house the flying boat's construction, so Hughes ordered a special hangar built at the Hughes Aircraft Plant in Culver City, California.
The building contractor was Del Webb Company, and they built the cargo building as a location to build the HK-1.
Building 15, or the cargo building, became the signature structure at the aircraft plant. The giant double-gabled hangar stretches the equivalent of the area taken up by 2 large aircraft carriers.
It was the 3rd of March in '43, as I recall, that we started laying out the boat on the floor. From the line drawings that we received from Hughes, which had dates on them, design dates on them of 1937 and 1938. So taking these drawings, we interpreted them into how this aircraft would be made and laid out the information on the floor in points, mathematically developed.
The birch parts were made from veneer varying in thickness from 1/64 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch.
We made plywood from 1/32 3-ply. As I remember, we were going up to 7-ply. The center plies were run through a glue spreader to put the glue on.
Workers laminated these together with special glue. Because of the great lengths of most parts, it was necessary to tie the ends of the veneers together before lamination. Birch billets for the wing spars were 6 inches wide by 8 inches thick by 90 feet long.
The system is very involved, but we had to calculate every move of that and then put it down on the floor, scribe it into the floor, and mark it and number it, so that every rib and every piece that was going to make up the aircraft had to be defined numerically. Having those done, why the edges of all of the pieces of the skin were now defined. This means that they could make plaster molds that met using these templates that would form the wood into these shapes.
Duramold was a patented process of molding wood and plastic materials under heat and pressure to form aircraft structures. Originally developed by Fairchild Aircraft Company, Howard Hughes purchased the rights to use it in large aircraft.
The average person thinks that a wood airplane can be made by going to a lumber yard and buy plywood and 2x4s and throwing them together and call it an airplane. That is not possible. Duramold came about as a means of getting as much strength out of wood as possible.
It was the first time that Duramold had ever been used on anything this large. So there was a great deal of lack of knowledge as to what the result would be when you got into these huge ribs and so on. How stable would they be? And they turned out to be quite stable, as a matter of fact.
Over a 3-year period, Hughes workers conducted extensive tests on wood-constructed joints and improved the Duramold process. They subjected the joints to a wide variation of conditions in moisture and temperature. They finally obtained a completely stable joint, which showed no deterioration. The final design of this aircraft called for 8 3,000 horsepower engines and wings 20 feet longer than a football field. After addressing the challenges of size and material, Hughes focused on the type and number of engines to use on the seaplane. Here he met with another dilemma. No engines existed that could lift an airplane with a gross payload of 400,000 pounds. Eventually, Pratt & Whitney issued a new design, the R-4360 Wasp Major Barrel, or corncob engine. Installing 8 of these 3,000 horsepower engines on his flying boat, Hughes gave her muscle equivalent to the power of 7 wartime-era locomotives. Hughes and National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, engineers performed wind tunnel and towing tank tests on scale models of the aircraft. The tests ensured that the flying boat would be both aero and hydrodynamic. Aluminum was again available for use in non-strategic aircraft. The War Production Board reviewed the flying boat project in early 1944. At issue was the material used in the aircraft's construction. Was wood construction really strong enough to withstand a 400,000-pound payload? Would the aircraft be better if constructed in metal? In a letter to the review committee, Hughes argued that if it was a mistake to start construction on the aircraft, it would be a bigger mistake to stop its construction altogether. Hughes prevailed in March 1944, and the contract continued, but without Henry Kaiser. In his decision to continue the contract, the government stated that completion of the project was no longer necessary for the war effort. Hughes could build the prototype under the terms of the original contract, but her sister ships were unnecessary. Another year passed. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the Hughes flying boat was still in pieces and under construction at Culver City. By now, the project had been underway for 3.5 years. With the dissolution of the Kaiser Hughes Corporation and as a result of an employee naming contest, the seaplane underwent a name change from HK-1 to Hercules.
They had a name the airplane contest. The somebody collected a few bucks by suggesting the name Hercules. That name lasted for a little while.
The name was short-lived, however, and she became known simply as the Hughes H-4 flying boat. In June, Hughes unveiled the airplane, and news about the enormous aircraft hit the headlines of newspapers across the country. Japan surrendered on September 2nd, 1945.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
And that made the big news official. Big, the biggest. 3 years and 8 months and 7 days after Pearl Harbor, the guns ceased firing and the killing ended. World War II was over. This was it. VJ Day. Peace. It's wonderful.
Hughes secured a graving dock site on Terminal Island at Long Beach, and by June 1946, he was ready for the flying boat's arrival. On June 11, 1946, Star Movers slowly moved the 160-foot wing sections, the flaps, vertical tail, and other components out of Building 15 and away from the Culver City plant. Engineers assured Hughes the roadbeds could withstand the weight of the heavy sections. Utility crews lifted more than 2,000 power lines so the caravan could pass. Schools recessed for the day, and a crowd of more than 100,000 lined the road for the procession. By summer's end, the large pieces began to look like an aircraft of mammoth proportions. Little by little, workers installed the engines and the electrical, hydraulic, and control systems that would bring life to the giant airplane. Criticism of the project escalated in Washington as the Hughes team assembled the flying boat in the Long Beach dry dock. Meanwhile, Hughes was ready to flight test the other aircraft he had been building under government contract. The XF-11 was an experimental photo reconnaissance aircraft with great speed and range capability. It had a twin-boom design and aluminum construction. On July 7, 1946, after gassing up with 1,200 gallons of fuel, twice the recommended amount, Hughes taxied the aircraft down the runway for flight testing. He had been flying for about 40 minutes when a hydraulic leak in the counter-rotating blades of the propeller system caused the XF-11 to crash. The extra fuel resulted in a fiery explosion, and Hughes barely escaped with his life. Members of the War Production Board continued to monitor the flying boat's progress. The prototype had exceeded the government's funding allowance. Although Hughes promised to pay for the cost overruns out of his own pocket, federal politicians again tried to cancel the project. A Senate investigation committee, headed by Maine Senator Owen Brewster, probed alleged profiteering by Hughes in his wartime contracts for the XF-11 and the flying boat. But were there other motives for Brewster and his minions?
So I ask you this question again, Senator Brewster. During my last trip to Washington, and while we were having lunch in your suite at the Mayflower Hotel, did you or did you not offer to call off this entire investigation if I would agree to merge TWA Trans World Airline with your friend Juan Tripp's
Pan American Airways.
$40 million has been paid by the government to the Hughes Aviation Company, and nothing has been thus far received. Investigation of this matter was commenced by Senator Truman as chairman of the committee 4 years ago, and has been continued in recent months under Senator Ferguson and at his insistence. There has never been any discussion of discontinuing the investigation so far as my knowledge goes, or that of any member of the committee. What became of the $40 million is what we want to know.
Meanwhile, Brewster took his attacks on Hughes and his airplanes to the press, which increased public interest in the Senate investigation.
And if you read that terrible testimony by Senator Brewster, where he called it a flying lumberyard, and all those things, did you write it? It was easy to do it. The war was over. Metal was being produced all over the world. It's easy to go back and say Hughes didn't have to do that. He did. He did have to do it. In fact, did he only build one? We only wanted one. The fact he did in the F-11, a great airplane. The war was over. But we forget to go back in time and say, when we need them, they were there.
Public awareness of the investigation was acute by the time Hughes appeared in Washington for his testimony before the Senate committee. On the afternoon of August 6, 1947, Hughes and his entourage entered the Senate office building and continued to the caucus room for the hearings.
Will you just raise your right hand to be sworn? You do solemnly swear in the matter now pending before this committee?
I do.
Just have a chair.
The committee accused Hughes of using government money for parties and other expenses not related to his aircraft contracts. To illustrate the point, and to poke at Roosevelt, Senator Ferguson questioned Hughes about his public relations man, Johnny Meyer, who had entertained the president's son, Colonel Elliott Roosevelt.
May I ask a question?
Well, now, if you'll just wait till I issue a subpoena for Mr. Mars, I've asked you whether or not you would produce him, and you said you didn't know, as I understand it.
I don't remember if that was my answer.
Well, what was your answer?
I don't remember. Get it off the record.
Well, now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now about a reply that I made. My answer is I don't remember. Now, the man is taking it down there.
Well, I'll ask you again. What? Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
No, I don't think I'll try.
All right. Truth, so help you God.
I do, Senator.
Just have a chair. Now, you paid a man by the name of Chick Farmer $50 to stop publicity of Roosevelt in New York, and that was Colonel Roosevelt, was it?
That's right.
Now, you said that could be explained very easily. Will you explain it?
We were in the El Morocco Club there, and the photographer started to take our picture. Mr. Roosevelt said he didn't care to have his picture taken. This fellow rather insisted on it. And I talked to Mr. Farmer, who was the publicity director of El Morocco, and he said he would see that it did not appear. And I gave him $50 to see that it didn't appear.
And there are efforts to find out whether there was any connection that I might have had with the chief executive, which might have had an effect on any war contracts. And I'm here to give you the complete facts.
The accusations irritated Hughes.
When Senator Brewster realized that he was fighting a battle against public opinion, a losing battle, he folded up and took a run-out powder. Yes, that was the tip-off. When Senator Brewster hit the road for the backwoods of Maine, that meant the hearing was over. Washington was too hot for him. He couldn't take it. After that, the other senators in this committee saw no reason why they should fight Brewster's losing battle for him if he was too cowardly to remain and face the music. They saw no reason to carry his banner against an overwhelming avalanche of public opinion.
All right.
I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Well, Hughes quickly departed Washington for California. He was determined to demonstrate the capability of both the XF-11 and his flying boat to Senators Brewster and Ferguson. He ordered his flying boat out of dry dock and set November 1st as the date for taxi testing. A storm intervened, postponing the flight until the next day. James McNamara didn't know it at the time, but just past noon on November 2nd, 1947, he got the scoop of a lifetime. I was working as the chief correspondent for United Press in Moscow at the time, and as I listened to the BBC broadcast of McNamara's coverage of the event, I could only imagine standing here on the flight deck and experiencing this beauty taking flight. But I'll let McNamara tell you about that.
This is James McNamara speaking to you from aboard the Howard Hughes 2,000-ton flying boat, the world's largest aircraft. Right now, Howard Hughes is at the wheel control, and he's nursing this aeronautical wonder on its maiden taxi run. Might add that it's a beautiful day out here off the coast of Southern California. Crystal blue skies, a warm sun, a slight spanking breeze from the northwest, and a relatively calm sea protected by the breakwater of the outer harbor. Huge crowds jammed the surrounding shoreline this morning when this gargantuan ship was first towed into the outer harbor. And right now, an armada of water taxis, PT boats, and private vessels are accompanying the Hughes ship on this running course this afternoon. Now we're plowing along at about 50 knots as we can gauge the speed. It feels like we're riding a souped-up ocean liner. That's about as close a simile as I can think of right now. There are 30 passengers aboard today, including the crew and members of press and radio. Howard, do you have time at this moment to explain for our radio listeners exactly what you're doing, the operation? Yes, that was right around 90 miles an hour. We were well up on the step, and the airplane could have lifted off easily if I just pulled back on the control, I'm sure, but we have so many mechanical devices in this ship right now that I want to check a few of them out a little bit before we try anything like that. And as I say, I previously estimated it'll be March or April before we're really ready to fly this airplane. This is James McNamara speaking to you from the cabin of the giant Hughes aircraft once again. Howard Hughes has just alerted us. He has asked everyone to hold on, and he'll get all 8 inches moving. Tremendous horsepower kicking up. Howard is sitting directly in front of us, holding on to his seat. Here we go. Here we go. The airspeed indicator has moved up to 25. It's 30. It's 35. As he pushes the throttle, it's 40. It's 45. More throttle. It's 45. It's 50. It's 50 over a choppy sea. It's 55. It's 55. More throttle. It's 60. It bounces to 65. It's 70. It's 75. And something momentarily he cuts out, and I believe we are airborne. We are airborne, ladies and gentlemen. I don't believe that Howard Hughes meant this to be. I don't know. We were airborne, and we were really up in the air. We were really up in the air. And I don't know whether Howard, did you expect that? Certainly, I like to make surprises. You were surprised or not? Oh, I said I thought I'd make a surprise. Well, it certainly surprised the people here.
What a day for aviation and the flight crew. Boy, did they have some stories to tell.
Mr. Hughes informed me that he would be using the transmission from there on. So I moved to my station, which was the electrical control panel.
There were two of us actually at the panel. At the last minute, we decided that I didn't have enough hands to handle it all. So my boss agreed to sit with me, and between us, we handled the flight engineer station.
Johnny Glenn was responsible for the auxiliary power units. And I had informed him that I wanted to keep them on all the time, but I wouldn't have them on the line until I thought it was necessary.
Merle didn't have enough power, and he kept giving me the sign and hollering at me. I could hear him, but I gave him all I had there. That's all. I had it screwed tight, as we call it, and it just wasn't enough at the time.
Well, on taxi run number 2, Mr. Hughes, on taxiing, asked the co-pilot to give him about 3 to 5 degrees of flat. And when he did that, we lifted off of the step. On the 3rd taxi, we felt it lift off of the step, and we were airborne, but we could feel it. It was very quiet.
Howard pulled the throttles back as soon as it come off the water, but we were up in the air pretty high then. And of course, I didn't know that because I couldn't see out.
When he lifted off, the right wing seemed to dip. And then he overcorrected with his control. The left wing went down slightly.
And about that time I looked around at Howard, and Howard was working the elevators like they were going to come out of the floor. He didn't have any hydraulic power because he had pulled the throttles back. So we didn't have an auxiliary hydraulic system then.
Then he brought it back to an even, and it was fine for landing. And we were all elated and pat each other on the back and said, hey, we did the job. And wonder what's next.
Sometime either just before or just after the flight, the Hughes flying boat acquired its most famous moniker, Spruce Goose. Interesting thing about that name, it doesn't relate to the wood material from which the aircraft is made, nor does it appear in the Senate investigation minutes or the newsreels. Some believe that the news media coined the name. You know how clever we can be. Nonetheless, Howard Hughes didn't like it.
You used HFB, HK1, H4, whatever, but do not use Spruce Goose. This was something that Howard did not like, and it was made quite obvious to us.
After flying her, Hughes had the flying boat placed in her graving dock and ordered a special climate-controlled hangar built over and around her, which he maintained at a cost of about $1 million a year. She remained at Terminal Island over the next 30 years in seclusion but not hibernation. Her crew immediately set to work making systems changes based on the data gathered during the taxi tests and short flight. Engineers made improvements on her flight control systems.
After the flight, we sat down with Howard and Mr. Hughes, and he said, I'll give you so long, I want this, and that fixed, and I'll give you so long. And we did it, and did it in a hurry.
The modification that I was most familiar with was the hydraulic system we put in, the auxiliary hydraulic. There was no auxiliary hydraulic in the original airplane.
Present-day airliners have controls that are very similar to what was developed on the HFB-1, Spruce Goose. So, in a way, the development of the Hughes flying boat contributed to modern-day designs of airliners.
Redundancy is something that the flying boat, I think, was probably the very first in having backup systems for the control surfaces, rudder, elevator, and aileron.
The company then sat down and designed electromechanical devices for each one of the engines.
The Hughes throttle controls that we finally used I run a lot of the tests on them on the test stand, and that was a real good system. It was pretty much like a mechanical system. It acted like a mechanical system.
Hughes and the Navy agreed to an exchange of the engines, the R-4360, to a newer, later, updated engine.
And we had to take them off once and take them all into Pacific Aeromotive and have some changes made. God, we had them off and on, I don't know how many times. Pratt Whitney would send out a change, so we'd have to pull the engines off and send them over to Pacific Aeromotive in Burbank and get it changed, then bring them back and hang them up again. So we were busy all the time.
If an engine fell off, they had to be concerned about whether the hydraulic plumbing would rip away some of the structure. So there were devices for breaking the plumbing that would break away if the engine fell. And that affected the hydraulic lines and the fire suppression lines.
At that time, we did not have CO2. We had methyl bromide. We didn't have the mechanism as you see there in the hull. You know, all the models there, those were added.
Her flight deck and interior design led to changes in other large capacity aircraft.
That's why the aircraft was considered to be an icon in aviation history, because so many things that were developed that went on to allow us to make big airplanes and make them successfully were the result of much of the work that was done here.
I was impressed that that vehicle would address the use of such complex materials on a relative basis at that date, and so that even brought to my attention how the flying boat represented really advancements in technology for its time frame.
I think that the flying boat has contributed quite a bit to aviation in general. It really was the beginning of all subsequent flight control systems, and really was something to be proud of.
In 1974, the Government Accounting Office, which held the legal title to the flying boat, contacted Hughes to make a deal. In exchange for the Hughes H-1 racer and large sums of cash, they would give Hughes full title to his beloved flying boat.
He didn't hesitate at all about the racer. The racer is one of the great airplanes of our generation. It is a great airplane. They give him that. But the flying boat, he never wanted to give him. But of all of his treasures, aerodynamic treasures, that's the most important.
But there was a catch. Upon Hughes' death, workers would disassemble the flying boat into 9 pieces unless a non-profit organization took custody of her. After Hughes passed away in 1976, the lease on the graving dock hangar at the Port of Long Beach expired. With no non-profit organization to take her, Summa Corporation, Hughes Holding Company, made plans to disassemble the historic seaplane. Hughes' old friend Jack Reel tried to find a new home for her.
I would have taken it to Destin, Pensacola, any place. I had to get that airplane taken care of. I didn't want to cut it up.
Arrangements were made for Summa to donate the aircraft to the nonprofit Aero Club of Southern California, which would then lease it to the Rather Corporation, headed by entrepreneur Jack Rather and his wife Benita Granville Rather, a former Hollywood movie star. Rather Corporation pledged enough money to move the flying boat to a temporary location while they built a dome in which to display her. Rather had just picked up the master lease on the RMS Queen Mary, berthed at Pier J in Long Beach. He felt that the world's largest airplane would make an exciting addition to the project. On October 29, 1980, the flying boat emerged from seclusion and into the world's spotlight. The world's largest floating crane, Hermann the German, lifted her onto the dock of the temporary storage area. After 16 months, the new dome was ready. Floating by barge, the flying boat moved from the temporary dock to Pier J, then gently eased into her new home adjacent to the Queen Mary. In the late 1980s, after the deaths of Jack and Bonita Rather, the Disney Corporation purchased the former holdings of the Rather Corporation. In March 1990, Disney informed the Aero Club of Southern California of its intention to discontinue the Dome exhibit, leaving the flying boat looking for yet another home. In 1992, the Aero Club of Southern California began requesting proposals for custody and preservation of the aircraft. Organizations submitting proposals had to meet two criteria: access to land on which to house the flying boat and the funding necessary to move and care for her.
Far and away, the Evergreen proposal was the best of all of the proposals we received. I mean, nobody was even close.
Evergreen's plan, as envisioned by Captain Michael King Smith, proposed to not only preserve and protect her, but also to display her as the central exhibit in a living museum.
When Evergreen was named the recipient of the flying boat, we were very impressed when a bevy of technicians and executives came from Marana and began taking apart the flying boat. Nobody knew where it came apart and how it came apart. The last time it was put together was in 1946, and it hadn't been disturbed since. And so it became a real challenge to disassemble.
A large opening was created in the dome, and the remaining pieces were shrink-wrapped and rolled out onto an ocean-going barge. After traveling 980 nautical miles, the flying boat arrived in Portland, Oregon. Thousands of people celebrated the arrival with an official proclamation of Spruce Goose Day on October 22nd at Tom McCall Waterfront Park. The large pieces remained in storage for several months.
We had a lot of trouble. It took 3 months to get the big stuff out because of the rivers, the water. Once you get to that mouth of the river, there's a lot of work to do. The Corps of Engineers helped them. They flooded the locks.
Finally, conditions improved, and the flying boat slowly made her way upriver, setting new records for the longest and highest load ever to pass through the locks. The flying boat arrived in McMinnville at Evergreen International Aviation on February 27, 1993.
Was that distance from Culver City to Long Beach was approximately 26 miles. So went overland for 26 miles, was assembled in Long Beach, and flew for a mile. So that's a total of 27 miles. So the distance from Long Beach to McMinnville, Oregon, was the longest trip the flying boat ever took. Ever.
Shortly after the successful arrival to McMinnville, museum co-founder Captain Michael King Smith died tragically as the result of an automobile accident. Delford M. Smith, father to Michael King Smith, persevered and continued his son's dream of an educational institute and living museum.
It was Mike's dream to build a museum, and it was Mike's dream to acquire the HK-1. The Hughes flying boat.
The project continued as dedicated crews of volunteers restored the flying boat's exterior in a temporary storage area.
They had 47,000 square feet of paint that needed to be scraped off and sanded and recoated. I spent many hours down here leading the volunteers in a restoration process.
So by the time we got down to the wood and we got started sanding, well, we began to see these signatures all over the hull.
The paint removal exposed inspection stamps, signatures of men and women who worked on the original construction, and evidence that the wood laminate had passed wind shear tests. The crew sanded the large pieces of the flying boat, primed them with a white latex finish, and repainted them in the original flight color of silver.
Our major goal was to preserve and restore the flying boat back to
the same condition and configuration that it was in on the day when it was out in 1947 for taxi tests and when it flew.
Preparations began for the final 800-foot move from temporary storage to the new 121,000 square foot museum building. It took a little over a year to reassemble the flying boat. Preparing for the arrival of the fuselage, workers positioned the wings on the right and left just as they had in 1946. Before assembly, the crew lowered the fuselage and its cradle into a 7-foot pit at the museum's center south side. Volunteers assembled the wings and vertical tail first, followed a short time later by the assembly of the pylons.
The challenges of hanging the engines were being able to move the engine while a person was standing in a man lift. So placing the engine on the firewall proved to be more challenging than we thought. However, once we had a routine down of getting the first one done, the rest were installed in no time at all. Replacing the fabric on the control surfaces was a monumental task. Thousands of knots had to be sewn. The ailerons were restored right here on the floor while we were still assembling portions of the aircraft. They're 71 feet long, and we used 2 pieces of fabric for each aileron. 1 piece of fabric on top and 1 piece of fabric on the bottom.
The propellers came to us boxed, literally in crates, disassembled. So one of the major projects, in addition to installing engines, was to reassemble these propellers. And we've actually put them back together in the same order and blades in the same position that they were in when it was installed in the Hughes hangar.
They painted and prepared the propellers, assembled them to the aircraft, and completed the assembly of the horizontal stabilizers just in time for the new museum facilities opening on June 6, 2001. On December 7, 2001, the 60th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, crews assembled the tail cone, signifying the completion of the flying boat's incredible journey.
And I felt like we were writing the last words in a chapter of aviation world history.
And with the final drive of her engines, 200 tons are airborne, 5 months ahead of time. 70 feet off the water, she stays for a mile. $23 million worth of airplane has answered a lot of committee questions. It can fly.
The flying boat is still the largest wooden aircraft ever built. Her legacy is the story of a nation's desire to protect freedom at a time of great peril. A rise to the challenge by great and common Americans. She tells the story of sacrifice, determination, and technological developments that embody the pioneering spirit of great aviators like Howard Hughes. This aircraft has traveled a long way since its conception in the dark days of World War II. Howard Hughes had a remarkable aptitude for aircraft design. The Hughes flying boat has endured many hardships to become a popular and important cultural artifact of American aviation. Her size and her capacity have shaped technology and revolutionized modern flight. She stands today as a monument to Howard Hughes' dreams of advances in aviation, developed but not recognized in his lifetime, and as a symbol of America's continuing dream to fly.
This airplane, from any point of view you take a look at it, certainly must be a picture of the world in which perhaps we're going to live tomorrow. Promising and awesome, tragic and inspiring. It's got everything, and I just hope it flies.
Well, I think that Howard made a terrific contribution to the aircraft industry. With his being a pilot, establishing speed records, cross-country records, all sorts of things. And as far as design and concept And I think that's probably what I admire about Howard Hughes the most.
The Hughes flying boat is amazing in its design, and the technology behind creating this machine was really advanced at the time, and it is amazing now to walk through and to witness the craftsmanship that it took to create it.
Howard Hughes made major contributions to aviation progress, technologically and just being a pioneer.
The Hughes flying boat, the Spruce Goose, is truly a historic aviation icon. To me, it is a national treasure.
So we think that while it didn't fly a great deal, it was the prototype to the heavy lifters that exist today. We realized that if we were awarded the aircraft, that we had a serious responsibility, and we knew that we had to build a quality facility for it.